I know you're clapping for them. Welcome. It's really a great honor to be the moderator of today's group debate on American news media, liberal or conservative bias. It's also great that you came out today when you could have done other beautiful things in beautiful Santa Barbara. I'd like to just make a few comments, lay out some of the ground rules, and then provide a brief introduction to our speakers today. There was a recent Pew People and the Press survey that reported that media users see considerable media bias. For each of the various media, these are the frequencies that felt there was bias. 27% felt that local TV was biased. 35% said network TV. 42% says newspapers. 42% CNN. 45% for radio. 45% for the internet. No bias on the internet. And shocking, 52% for Fox News. We think that bias in general, and media bias in particular, is really a crucial issue, and that's why we had the group debate today. Media bias misinforms and misleads citizens. And in my mind, this breaks the crucial link in a democracy. It leads to flawed policy, significant harm, wasted resources, and hatred. Binary bias, such as between conservative and liberal, which is the labeling today, itself is a form of bias, because it leaves out so many other positions, people, and issues. Bias also reinforces our own selective perceptions. Here's an example. On Amazon, if you order 2 or more books, the system notes this. It keeps track of any 2 books that have been ordered together, and when someone else looks at any one of those books, as you know, it comes up and recommends other books that have also been recommended along with this one or bought with this one. Mapping the relationships among these political books reveals an extremely partisan audience. Almost all liberal books are related only to each other. That is, people who buy or look at one only buy or look at another liberal book. And almost all conservative books are also related only to each other. There's only a very few books that are in the middle that are bridges between these 2 worlds. A study of links among the top 40 political blogs found exactly the same polarization and the lack of connections between the 2 camps. In some ways, media bias is like professional wrestling, as you may see today. With professional wrestling, many are worried about the effects of its violence. With media bias, many are worried about the effects of its pervasive disinformation. With both, supporters often say it's just the freedom of speech, it's just staged entertainment, and after all, it's what the audience wants. But to me, the main and undiscussed threat of professional wrestling, which is oxymoron, I suppose, is that it encourages and rewards cheating and breaking the rules. If you watch the shows, the people who are heroes are the ones who sneak up on the back of the ref and bat him with a chair. Think how Hulk Hogan has turned to the dark side and maintained his popularity. Don't mean to offend any Hulk Hogan fans in the audience. And to me, the deeper long-term threat of media bias is how it's destroying our belief in open, honest, and informed discourse. So we end up getting personalities instead of policy, evasion instead of evidence, innuendo instead of information, and diatribe instead of debate. And cell phones instead of listening. This is more and more common in TV and radio debates where positions and comments are fragmented, they're limited to sound bites, personal insults, interruptions, and shouting, and very narrow perspectives. Debates of any kind are rare on the internet, where instead each person in position has his own unchallenged say. However, informed and unbiased debate from multiple positions is central to the academic profession and this institution. Therefore, we have this debate series, so we would expect a slightly different approach to issues. For the debate, here's the guidelines that we've agreed upon. Each speaker will first get time to argue on the merits of well-thought ideas and verifiable evidence. Well-thought ideas and verifiable evidence. And to respond. Each person gets 15 minutes and then 5 minutes for their initial rebuttal. This is debate. We have to keep to time. I will give each person a 2-minute warning. Do not interpret this as me as cutting off debate, please. We'll then have 15 minutes while I'll ask a series of questions based upon my own background research and things that they say today, and then we'll have a 15 or 20-minute period where we'll take questions from the audience from these 2 microphones. We do ask that you keep your questions short and clear. Keep your rants and prolegomenas to some other setting. And finally, I'm going to ask each speaker to provide a 2-minute concluding statement, and then there'll be an opportunity to talk with our speakers and sign books. Your programs provide some detailed introductions, but let me give you just a summary. Eric Alterman, He's a columnist for The Nation, Worth, Rolling Stone, Mother Jones, and the Sunday Express. He's a web blogger from MSNBC. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and also at the World Policy Institute at the New School University. Mr. Alterman has written 6 books on topics such as presidential deception, his recent book, the role of democracy in foreign policy, the rise of punditocracy, which is a great word, and yes, also on Bruce Springsteen. He received his PhD in U.S. history from Stanford. He's currently a professor of English at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. Tucker Carlson is the host of The Situation with Tucker Carlson on MSNBC. He's also contributed to the network's Hardball with Chris Matthews program, with reports on the Vatican and on politics. He's previously served as co-host of CNN's political debate program Crossfire. He also served as co-host of CNN's Spin Room program and as a political analyst for the network. He's also been a host and managing editor of a weekly public affairs program on PBS, and also a longtime magazine and newspaper journalist, including writing for New York Magazine, Reader's Digest, Esquire, The Weekly Standard, and the New York Times Magazine. And he has a recent book on his experiences in cable news. So please welcome our guests once again. We begin with Mr. Carlson.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm really happy to be at UCSB. I grew up in La Jolla, not far from here, and UCSB always had this kind of mythic status in the minds of 12-year-old boys in La Jolla. UCSB was where you wanted to go mostly for the volleyball team, not the boys' volleyball team. I'm glad I finally made it to UCSB, so thanks a lot for having me. And I'm sorry I don't have time to see your volleyball team in action. I've got to go take the red eye home tonight to New York. The question of media bias. Well, I often get this in my personal life via email or letters written on the outside of the envelope in crayon to the effect, "You're biased! You're biased!" Of course I'm biased. That's my job. I am completely upfront about my political positions, about my political biases. I am a right-winger, sort of a libertarian right-winger, but I'm far out, and I make no secret of it. I mean, I'm this close to stockpiling food and ammunition and moving to Idaho. I mean, I'm on that side. And I never make any bones about that. I never pretend to be, moderate, sensible guy. I never pretend, that maybe we can sort of meet in the middle here. No, I think what I think, and I say so. And occasionally I change my mind based, I think, on the evidence. And when I'm wrong, I admit it. But for me, in my life, as someone who hosts a show nightly on TV, is the criterion is very simple: tell the truth. So I tell the truth as I see it, but very much from my own perspective. So yes, I am biased. My job, however, and this is the point of what I want to say briefly, is very different from that of a newspaper reporter or a television reporter. Those so-called, in the news business, straight reporters whose job merely is to tell you what happened. Their job when a plane crashes is to tell you who was on the plane, when did it crash, what happened, how many people perished, et cetera, et cetera. Their job is just to bring you the facts, and to bring you those facts unpolluted by their preconceptions and unbiased by any agenda they might have. In other words, they're supposed to tell you the news without trying to make a case for a particular position or not. This is a really important, it goes without saying, though it is always worth saying, a really important function of the press, the most important function. And here's why. In a democracy, it is vital that citizens have a common frame of reference for reality. There has to be a place where all citizens can go and look at facts about what happened yesterday and say, you know what, I agree that that's probably roughly what happened. The electorate's confidence in the news being real is all important. You see this when you go to other countries that don't have a history or a tradition of a straightforward, honest press, like places like Pakistan, where I've spent a lot of time, where the press has always been dishonest, every newspaper is an organ of a political movement or other, and people have come over time to become really cynical about the press. They don't believe anything that is written in newspapers because they assume all of it is just another man's view. All of it is bias. And so in the absence of any universally recognized standard or source of news, what happens? Well, rumors take the place of news. And so ultimately you have an electorate that is really poorly informed and incredibly suspicious. And in that environment, all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories bloom and take the place of facts. I'll never forget when I went to Pakistan on my way to Afghanistan directly right after 9/11, literally about an hour after I landed in Islamabad, the English language paper there called Dawn, which is actually a pretty good paper by Pakistani standards. Not that I can read the ones written in Urdu, but in any case, by English language standards, it's pretty good, had a headline claiming that Al Gore was responsible for the 9/11 attacks, and they spelled his name lowercase al-Gore. And it claimed that Al Gore was the head of this Zionist conspiracy to knock down the Twin Towers. Sort of amazing. This was on page 1 of the New York Times of Islamabad. Such are the fruits of a society where nobody believes anything he or she reads in the press. So objectivity, if not the reality, which is unattainable, but at least the appearance of objectivity, at least the goal of objectivity in news coverage is essential, or else things fall apart. Well, I think the American press does a pretty good job, having spent a lot of time abroad in the past 15 years. Whatever hang-ups I have or whatever anger I feel toward news coverage, I try to compare that with things I've seen abroad, and I think we're doing a pretty good job by comparison, but we're still not living up, I think, to the standard we set for ourselves in the press, and here's the standard. The standard, as I said a second ago, is not perfect objectivity, right? Reporters will always advocate for things simply because everybody in this country pretty much agrees on certain things. America is worth preserving as a country, racism is bad, murder is immoral. I mean, there are some common assumptions that we have that are literally common, everybody has them pretty much, and we agree are worth preserving. So every reporter is, in some sense, taking a stand. But no straight reporter ought to take a stand on issues that are contested, on which there really is a divide. And on several of those issues, there is overwhelming media bias. Now, I'm sure there are probably 1 or maybe 2 people in this room who agree with my politics. And let me say to you, who I'm sure are angry at the press because you see the press as left-wing, as an organ for international socialism, let me just reassure you that that's not entirely true in most cases. Most reporters are not advocating a socialist position. They'd be a lot more interesting as a group if they were. They're not. Most reporters are not radical leftists. Most reporters are well-educated, upper-middle-class white kids from the coasts who do not go to church or synagogue. They are secular. They are the product of coastal culture. I grew up, as I said a second ago, in Los Angeles and La Jolla. I moved to Washington. Now I live outside New York. I went to school in New England. I've always lived on the coasts. I'm fairly well-educated. And I guess reasonably affluent by international standards. So I fall into that same category. So I'm not attacking the group, which I'm sure makes most of you are members of that group too. But I will say this, and you can all look to your own personal lives as verification. That group, like any other group, has a fairly restricted worldview. In that group, it is not considered acceptable to be, let's say, I don't know, a radical Baptist evangelical who marches against abortion on the weekends. Fair? Highly aggressive Second Amendment advocate whose hobby is paintball and who, goes to services every single night. Those would be considered sort of weird qualities or beliefs or hobbies within that group of people, right? Here's the problem. When you have a newsroom comprised entirely of people from pretty much the same towns, who went to pretty much the same schools, you have a group of people with pretty much the same cultural assumptions. You get them all in one place, and they have a tendency not to question their own assumptions, which is a huge problem in the business of journalism, which supposedly is supposed to be about questioning your own assumptions on the way to what? The truth. So, bottom line, everybody in journalism is pro-choice, is for legal abortion. It's almost unquestioned. Everybody in journalism is for gay rights. Nobody in journalism knows anybody who owns a gun or who is open about being religious. These are overstatements, but only slightly. Now, you often hear the argument, Well, sure. And by the way, these are not just my perceptions as someone who grew up in a family in journalism. My father was in journalism, and I've obviously been in it my whole life. These are not just my observations. There are studies on this, and I'm sure when Eric comes up, a man who's actually written a book on the subject, we can trade dueling studies. But let me just say, I don't even think Eric will contest this. It is true that the overwhelming majority of reporters are socially liberal. They may be economically conservative. I'm not sure. They're definitely socially liberal. And the counter-argument is, well, so what? A reporter's job is to overcome his own personal biases in pursuit of the truth, and our reporters do a pretty good job. Really? Is that true? Do you think, ask yourself this if you believe that, do you think the coverage of, say, abortion would be the same if 90% of all reporters were opposed to abortion, were pro-life? Do you think the coverage would be the same? If 90% of reporters were against gay marriage, do you think the discussion of gay marriage would be the same? The reporting on gay marriage would be the same? If 90% of reporters were members of the NRA, do you think the coverage of gun control would be the same? Of course not. What a crock. It would not be the same. And the coverage of those three issues is biased. Now, there's a very famous four-part series done in 1990 by the media critic of the Los Angeles Times, a man named David Shaw, that showed conclusively on specifically the subject of abortion that the coverage of it was, to the pro-choice side, extremely. I don't think that's changed. I'm going to give you a couple quick examples. Notice the language that is used to discuss abortion. What is the language you read about in newspapers? You have abortion rights advocates and you have abortion rights opponents. Well, let me submit to you that in America, if you are opposed to rights of any kind, merely the formulation, the suggestion you might be against a right, it doesn't matter what it is. You are the bad guy by definition. America is a country that loves rights. Americans love rights. If you're against rights, you have a strike against you from day one. Why not refer to people who are opposed to legal abortion as opponents of legal abortion? These aren't people who are against rights. They don't wake up every morning thinking, I want to curtail someone's right to do something. They wake up every morning thinking, I want to stop children from being killed in this process of abortion. Why not just say that in the way you describe them? Interesting question, and a question I raised with the editor of a newspaper I once worked for. And I said, gee, I know I went into his office, and I wasn't any sort of political activist or anything, but I said, gee, Mr. Editor, I know you want to run a straight-down-the-middle newspaper. Why not go ahead and describe the people who oppose abortion as opposing abortion? Why describe them as opponents of a certain right when, in fact, they don't even recognize that that right exists? And he kind of looked at me like I was from outer space. Huh, yeah, okay. And then just kind of stood there silently. And I sort of uncomfortably said, well, I just thought I'd tell you what I think. Uh-huh, all right, see you then. That was it. The words didn't even process with him. He looked at me like I was a full-blown, snake-handling wacko. Now keep in mind, this newspaper was in Arkansas. So it's not as if I was, working for the Upper West Side of Manhattan neighborhood weekly, right? This was Arkansas. And this was the feeling there. And it struck me then, this is the problem. When you have people who all think the same, you will never cover the news accurately. Now, this is a widely understood phenomenon when it comes to race and ethnicity. Yes, sir. Thank you. Which is why newspapers and television networks spend so much time and money attempting to recruit minority journalists. Why? Well, there are probably a lot of different reasons, but the stated reason is this. You can't cover America until you have a newsroom that looks like America. Okay, I'll accept that. How about a newsroom that thinks like America? How about that? There has been no effort, as far as I know, to reach out to people who, I don't know, didn't go to prestigious Northeastern schools or schools like UCSB, who didn't go to coastal schools, who aren't essentially upper middle class people. There's been no effort whatsoever. And the suggestion of it invariably brings a kind of quizzical, cocked-headed response like, you must be insane, which leads to things like this. The two other topics I mentioned at the outset on which there is unanimity in newsrooms, abortion, gun control, and gay rights. 2 days ago, CNN, where I labored for many years, 7, but it felt like more, gave $100,000 to the National Lesbian Gay Journalists Association, an organization I don't have any hostility toward, actually. They once asked me to give the keynote address at their convention, and one of my kids was born that day, so I couldn't, but I'm not against them. I don't think they're evil. They're a pressure group, however. They exist to make certain, through lobbying, that news coverage conforms to their view of the world, which is a very specific and very political view of the world. They want news organizations to toe their line. In that way, they are like every other group, the NRA, the National Right to Life, B'nai B'rith, you name it, they're a pressure group. And CNN, 2 days ago, gave them $100,000. Now, why would a news organization give $100 grand to a group that exists to fight objectivity? It is a good question. Ponder that as Mr. Alterman speaks. Thank you.
I want to begin today with a couple of cheap shots, if I might. No, seriously, I thought I was going to come up here and work on your sympathy by saying, okay, I'm debating Tucker. He's a reasonably nice guy, but I did, in fact, agree to come here and debate Robert Novak a year ago, and I wanted points for that until I realized that Tucker debated him. Tucker worked with him every day. So he wins on that scale. That I'm a mere piker on the having to deal with Robert Novak scale. The other reason I thought, I deserve a little indulgence. Well, one, if things get really bad, I'll mention that it's my birthday, but I won't use that yet. I don't need that one yet. But the other thing that I thought I needed to mention is that those of you who've only seen Tucker on Crossfire and on MSNBC and with Jon Stewart and so forth, thought that I would have a much easier time of things because you had a different impression of Tucker than you got today, I think. That Tucker's actually a very good journalist. His work on his interview with George Bush, which has sort of disappeared into the ether, where George Bush was making fun of the people who were asking for clemency from the death penalty and laughing about it with his advisor, Alberto Gonzales, who they bragged that they only spent 15 minutes considering whether or not death penalty should go through. Tucker was responsible for that very important piece that doesn't get much mention anymore. And he wrote a very sympathetic and very funny piece I read in Esquire about going to Africa with Al Sharpton, something I don't think I could have done. So he's not. It's a tougher task than it would have been making mincemeat of Robert Novak, who manages to do it himself without me. I do want to, before I have a few notes here, but I want to take issue on two factual points with Tucker that just so you can hold them for later. One is that I would dispute his description of the coverage of the abortion issue. I think ever since the David Shaw articles, which proved to be incredibly influential in 1990, that the two sides are described as pro-choice and pro-life. And that wasn't the case before, but now it is, and I think you'll see that terminology more than any other, and I think that's a demonstration of the genuine desire to be professional, to be objective. And sure, objectivity is impossible, but when you point out something and you provide the evidence, journalists see that and they respond to it, and I think that's actually a case for the other side. I also would dispute Tucker's description of the gay and lesbian journalist organization as a pressure group to get the news biased on their side. My understanding of what they do is to promote the hiring of gay and lesbian journalists, with the only pressure in that argument is that they're saying that gay and openly gay and lesbian journalists have the same right to be hired as journalists as anybody else does. And they're a pressure group in the sense that a handicapped group who says that you should hire handicapped people are a pressure group. They're not asking for a biased view of the news unless your bias is that these people are, for some reason, less than human and not entitled to the same rights as everybody else. So I just think that that's a important distinction to make. I don't know if we need to argue about that, but I'm perfectly happy to. Now, on this issue of, as I am on almost anything, on this issue of media bias, it's an incredibly rich topic for debate because there's really no normative way to measure it in an academic environment. Natural scientists, of course, and social scientists as well, tend to conduct experiments where they control variables. But you can't control the variable in media bias because time moves on and the issues change. So, you know, I can say that President Clinton lied about getting a blowjob from an intern, and President Bush lied about whether or not Iraq presented a threat to the United States and was therefore necessary to go to war against. Those two lies are not equivalent, no matter what you think. Maybe you think it's worse to lie about blowjobs. The point is that you can't say that the president was called a liar 18 times in one instance and only 17 times in the other instance, and that proves bias. The two issues are not comparable. Issues change. And so it's therefore entirely an art rather than a science. And again, it reflects as much our unstated, often unknown assumptions as anything else. Now, I've been in this position ever since I published What Liberal Media, where I'd go on television and they would say to me, here's Eric Alterman, who thinks that the media is actually conservative and not liberal. Isn't that amusing? How do you explain that? And when everybody in the world knows that it's not true. And I would argue that the reason that everybody in the world, quote unquote, knows that the media are liberal and not conservative, and by the way, it's very important, I'm a professor of English, even though I don't have a degree, but I'm a professor of English, and it's very important to say the media are, not the media is. I always forget to do it myself. But the reason that is because the media are a vast herd of incredibly unruly and contradictory beasts. Are we talking about the New York Times? Are we talking about the National Enquirer? Are we talking about Fox News? They're all the media. Are we talking about Hollywood? They're all the media. So you have to define your terms when you're talking about media. We're talking, by and large, about the elite media, largely in New York and Washington, and also somewhat on the coast. And I would agree that 40 years ago, that conservatives had a case. That when Arthur Schlesinger published The Vital Center, and Lionel Trilling published The Liberal Imagination around the turn of the century, and Daniel Bell published The End of Ideology in 1966, that conservative ideology didn't even exist for America's leading intellectuals and for the elite media. That there was no such thing. In fact, this was one of Trilling's laments in that book, that there was no conservative ideological tradition to keep liberalism from growing intellectually flaccid. Now, the turning point in American history on this point is the election of 1964, when Barry Goldwater's supporters, very wealthy supporters, the most significant of whom was a man named Richard Mellon Scaife, decided that it was going to be impossible for them to get their message, to get their candidates elected if they couldn't get their message across through this media, which basically had contempt for their views, and I think it's fair to say that it did. And so conservative billionaires, Scaife, Coors, a bunch of others around that time, later joined by Wall Street and neoconservative intellectuals who sort of went on a mission to convince corporate America that they needed to engage in this same operation. They invested hundreds of billions of dollars in transforming the ideological landscape of American politics. If you looked in the Heritage Foundation guidebook for young job seekers in Washington in the year 2000, you would find 300 separate conservative organizations, pressure groups, and think tanks where young people are funneled into jobs or where you try to get a job. There's nothing remotely like that on the left. There is an enormous network of ideas and now of media operations. Things like Fox News and the entire Murdoch empire and the Wall Street Journal editorial page and the whole talk radio universe and most of cable TV and this whole interlocking group of think tanks and so forth, of which there are hundreds, and they're incredibly well funded. There's, I mean, the Heritage Foundation alone, it's just one of them, of these 300 in Washington, is a $35 million a year organization. Until the Center for American Progress was founded last year, there wasn't a single self-consciously liberal think tank in Washington that had a budget of more than $2 million. Now there's one with a budget of about 10 million. But there's the Heritage Foundation, there's the Hoover Institute, there's Cato, there's AEI. All of these are 20, 30 million dollar a year organizations, 15 million maybe. Cato is actually equivalent to the center, that at about 15 million. And there's nothing like that on the left. Now, this has had two effects over the 40-year period that the conservatives have built this machine. On the one hand, it's allowed them to create their own little world, their own world where you can live your entire life in a conservative bubble. You don't ever have to get your news, the sort of agreed upon form of news that Tucker was describing. Again, which is not possible on the left. But the second thing it's done is, and this is what they had in mind when it was begun, is it's had an enormously powerful gravitational pull on the mainstream media. So that what used to be considered a liberal position is now considered a crazy position. What used to be considered a conservative position is now considered a centrist or a liberal position. And it's enormously effective regardless of whether or not it's true. In 1980, the chairman of the Republican Party, Richard Bond, said, yeah, we understand that the media aren't as biased as we always say they are. We're just working the refs. We want to get a better call from the refs. Now, if you think about that metaphor, working the refs, think about a coach in a basketball game who is always screaming at the ref that the ref is being unfair to his side. The referee has three choices. He can eject the coach from the game because he's being disruptive. He can listen to what the coach is saying and see if maybe the coach has a point, or he can throw him a few calls just to shut him up. Okay? The media can't eject the conservatives from the game. They don't have that power. So they have the only two choices are to listen to their case and make an honest choice about whether or not they're right, or just throw them a few calls to shut them up. And I would submit that the easiest thing to do is to throw them a few calls. In fact, throw them more than a few calls. Throw them quite a few calls. And most conservatives now, I think, would agree largely with what Tucker said, that the media are not biased liberally. They're not, certainly not self-consciously. But the conservative movement has seen this tactic to be so effective that they won't give it up. Tucker's former colleague at the Weekly Standard, Matt Labash, has called this the racket that they have. He said it's a pretty nice little racket. We complain about lack of objectivity. Well, we ourselves are not objective. And I wouldn't give it up either if I were them. I mean, if I were in politics, it's very effective. But it has incredibly nefarious implications. And the nefarious implications are clear if you examine, say, the debate over the Iraq War. Now, there was a study done by the Program on Policy Attitudes at the University of Maryland that examined people's understanding of the facts about Iraq and their position on the war. And they discovered that that in order to support Bush's arguments to go to war, you had to believe, on average, 2 of the 3 falsehoods that the administration was perpetrating. Now, when I say falsehoods, I'm not saying things that were contested, like we don't know, like maybe they did have the pre-war belief that there were weapons of mass destruction, which was just something that that a lot of people believed and turned out not to be true. I'm talking about things that were clearly false. Okay. And it turns out that the correlation between believing these false things was directly responsible for people supporting the war. And these conservative media outlets like Fox News were, the more you watch them, the more likely you were to be wrong. The more likely you were to endorse what I think, and I think Tucker agrees, has turned out to be a ruinous result for the United States, which was sold to us unfair. It was sold to us untruthfully. And it was sold to us untruthfully in a way that makes a mockery of our system of democratic accountability. Now, how is it that we went to war with a majority of Americans believing that that Iraq was responsible for 9/11? How is it that we went to war 2 years after 9/11 with 44% of Americans believing that a majority of the hijackers themselves were Iraqis? Okay? Now, if we had a liberal media, even if we had a strong, contentious, objective media, that wouldn't make any sense. But the media were unable to stand up to this conservative onslaught, which is led which has been going on for 40 years, and which is now led by the executive branch of the government of the United States. And so you can say that most journalists are pro-gay rights and so forth. It's true. But the structure of the media is such that that's not the kind of news it produces. The kind of news it produces between a combination of the power of this right-wing machine, the willingness of the Bush administration to play hardball, and the interests of the media conglomerates, the 6 media conglomerates that control most of the news that people see and hear, is that we get an extremely biased version of the news that is biased towards power. And that power in this country is largely corporate power. Thank you.
All right. So Fox News got us into the war in Iraq. If you support the war in Iraq, you're dumb, and you got dumb from watching Fox News. I don't like Fox News, and I don't like the war in Iraq. But that's ridiculous. Hillary Clinton supported the war in Iraq. Tom Daschle supported the war in Iraq. Do they support it because they were watching too much O'Reilly? I don't think so. People supported the war in Iraq for a whole bunch of different reasons. Most of them, in my view, as an opponent of the war, were wrong. But to say they were all misled is a dodge. I lived in Washington at the time. I covered closely, daily, the debate that preceded the war. I went to Iraq after the war. I've reached the only conclusion you could reach, which is it was not ignorance that got us into that war. It was bad judgment. It wasn't the fault of Fox News for all its many faults. That's a dodge. So, just to clear that up, just to make certain we all have that straight. Eric makes some very good points, I think. I completely agree with his analysis, which I think is a deep analysis, and you don't often hear it, or you don't hear it enough anyway, of the realignment in American political thought, actually, after the 1964 election in which Barry Goldwater got completely creamed. The conservative movement, small as it was really sent into exile, and that turned out to be a great thing. Without going into a long, boring explanation, taking up where he left off, he's right. Basically, some rich people got together. I think he overemphasizes Dick Scaife's role in all that, but it's essentially true. Rich people funded think tanks for conservatives where they sat for the next 25 years and thought about what they believe, and they came up with a pretty systematic worldview called conservatism, and it believed some fairly simple, straightforward, and yes, appealing things. It believed in limited government, an energetic foreign policy, lower taxation, right, individual liberty, things that most Americans, it turns out, believe. We can sum up conservative beliefs pretty easily. In that same amount of time, liberalism kind of fell apart. There's a second half of the story that I don't think Mr. Alterman brought to you, and that is that American liberalism became harder and harder to define, and it reached a point where we are today, where American liberalism is what? I don't know, a kind of vague discontent with America. American liberals sort of know that things aren't going right, and I'm not saying it's totally unjustified. I'm vaguely discontented by America, okay? So I'm not calling anybody anti-American. I'm merely saying that a vague discontent with the way things are going does not add up to a political philosophy, and certainly not a winning political strategy. And the proof is in the elections. So you can't fight something with nothing. That's one of the reasons you see so few compelling liberal debaters on television. They don't have a very good storyline to tell. They don't have very effective debate points. They don't have very compelling ideas. I'm sorry to say that. American politics is cyclical. The conservatives are in the midst of falling apart right now. The Republican Congress has been in power for, what, 12 years, and it's kind of already destroyed itself. And I'm not defending...
2 minutes.
It'll take even less than that to sum up. 20 years from now, hopefully you'll still ask me to come back, and I will be up here lamenting whatever happened to conservatism. We can point to 2006 as the year when it fell apart, and liberals may have vibrant, interesting ideas. And people will say, gee, why don't you see any right-wingers on TV? And I hope be honest enough to say, because they don't have anything to say. But that's what you can fairly say about liberals now. Yes, it's easy to critique the Bush administration's mishandling of foreign policy, and I do it every day. But that critique does not add up to a positive or compelling worldview. Liberals don't have that right now. Let me just make one final point. You heard Eric contrast liberals versus the media. The most telling line in everything he said over 15 minutes. Liberals versus the media. The media ought to be comprised of conservatives and liberals and centrists and people from those dreaded red states in the middle that nobody, can remember the capitals of, right? I'm serious. It ought to have people from all over America. Not just high IQ kids from, the New York suburbs. It shouldn't. It's bad for America, right? So When we reach a point when we can't simply say conservatives versus the media or liberals versus the media, that's when we know we have a media that is really representing the country. Ha!
I don't need that birthday thing after all. Forget about that. Got a little 7-year-old girl at home, doesn't get to spend her birthday with his birthday with daddy. Don't worry about that. I agree, by the way, that I only have 15 minutes here. I got a lot to do. But Tucker's absolutely right. Liberalism collapsed in many regards of its own way. Vietnam was a liberal war. Liberals didn't know. I mean, basically, liberalism began to collapse. The other side of that story is when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill in 1964, the Democratic Party fell apart. And he said, I'm destroying the Democratic Party in the South for the next generation when he signed it, and he was right. And that's been actually the main transformation. I don't think there's any evidence that Americans have gotten any more conservative on most of the issues. It's just that the South has moved into the Republican side, and that's given them a lock on the electoral system. You know, very few people know this. It's not that in the country, more people voted for Democratic representatives and senators in the last election than voted for Republicans. The number of people, there's supermajorities from what would be considered liberal positions in most issues. Supermajorities of Americans are willing to pay higher taxes for universal health care. They say they are. I mean, we don't know for sure. But supermajorities of Americans say they are willing to pay higher taxes for to protect the environment. Supermajorities of Americans think that actually that George Bush misled the country into war, and a large plurality of Americans blames George Bush for the war more than they blame Saddam Hussein. It says George Bush is responsible, not Saddam Hussein. I could go on and on about this. What I find interesting about it is that I'd say the country is roughly evenly divided along political terms, roughly. But the entire cable universe and the entire political discourse is dominated by people who support George Bush and by the assumptions that are put forward by George Bush. And it's even larger than that, because if you think about it, I'm a liberal, okay? I care about the environment. I care about human rights, okay? Every day I read the business section of the New York Times. I don't read the human rights section. I don't read the labor section. I don't read the environment section. And yet, who's to say that stock prices are a better thermometer, a better measure of human progress than the quality of our environment? Then why are corporations more important than the people who work in them? Our entire the unexamined assumptions of our political system are by and large, not exclusively, but by and large, conservative assumptions. And that's in large measure the result of this enormous, part of it is historical, but a large section of it is because of this enormous investment that conservatives have made in getting their voice heard. And you might call it propaganda, you might not, but I don't want to attach any nefarious things to it because it's quite out in the open. But the very idea that if you watch the media, the war on terror, the Iraqi resistance or the Iraqi insurgents, whatever they are, they're called terrorists, okay? Why are they called terrorists? They're fighting a foreign occupier. I think we're better guys than they are. I hope we win now that we're there, but there's no definition of terrorism that fits that. Why is the war in Iraq spoken largely as part of the war on terror? What in the world has the Iraqi war got to do with the war on terror? I'll tell you something. The CIA warned George W. Bush before the invasion, a few weeks before the invasion, that there was no terror threat to the United States emanating from Iraq. There hadn't been one in at least 10 years, but there would likely be one if the United States invaded Iraq. That's exactly what's happened. Now, it seems to me, 2 minutes. It seems to me that's the perfect argument that any sane person would have to accept against invading a country. They're not a threat now. If you invade them and get all your people killed and make the world hate you and create all these problems for yourself, then you're going to create the threat you say you're defending against. Okay? That's a definition of a bad idea. This is not The Nation magazine telling him this. This is the CIA of the United States. But that fact had no power in the system. It wasn't censored. We don't have formal censorship. It was on the front page of the New York Times. But it wasn't picked up. It wasn't debated. It wasn't discussed. Everything was all about how it's going to be democracy and they're all going to be dancing the hora next week. And that's because the discourse is controlled by this administration and its conservative allies. So if you tell me the New York Times is a liberal newspaper, I say if you got a liberal newspaper with Judy Miller covering weapons of mass destruction, you can have it.
Give you a lavalier? Yeah. You put on your lavalier. You can imagine that we could have fantastic discussions and presentations by both of these people. Is this on?
You got to turn it on.
One of these? I'm on. There we go. There we go. Is that better? Great. Thank you. You can imagine that we could have wonderful insights and presentations by both of these people for quite a long time, and you will certainly have opportunity through various media over many years to come. We have a few questions here and then some from the audience. One thing I'd like to just open up with, and I'll ask each of you the same question, and you have 2 minutes, is a very general one that you've touched on a little bit, but the question is, should the media in fact be unbiased? And if that's the case, what would unbiased media look like? And I'll let you start, Mr. Carlson.
Well, I touched on this a bit. I mean, I think the press can never be totally, I mean, nobody can ever be completely unbiased. What you don't want to be is stealthy about your bias. You don't want to be dishonest, is another way of putting it, right? If you come to something with a preconception that you're unable to shake and that colors your reporting, you ought to say so, right? I mean, much in the same way, at news organizations, we require people who have conflicts of interest to go ahead and say so. We require business reporters to divest of companies they may report on, right? So if I've got, you know, a huge amount of GE stock, I can't be the GE reporter, and we all understand why. And if I am the GE reporter, I have to put at the end of the piece, incidentally, I own GE stock. We should not allow reporters to cover things where their preconceptions will influence their coverage, because that is lying, right? That is not telling the truth. And lying is something we want to at least try to avoid. You can never fully avoid it. I mean, of course people's preconceptions are going to color what they report. And in some cases, it's not necessarily bad. As I said when I was rambling on up there a minute ago, there are some preconceptions that make us American. We all, I think, instinctively believe in democracy, representative democracy. We believe in freedom in the most general sense. We think the United States is a better country than most countries, presumably, if we live here. You know, murder is better than not killing somebody. I mean, you know, the obvious things that we all sort of agree on. But if it is in any way a contested political issue, if there is a real divide on a question in this country, you know, if fewer than 99.9% of Americans believe in something, we ought to make an effort to make coverage of that as straightforward and unbiased as we can. I mean, it seems an obvious standard. I mean, that's why I never really have understood journalism school. I mean, I'm the third generation in my family to practice journalism without a degree in it, and maybe so I'm just, you know, I'm defensive or something, but I never have really understood exactly what the point of journalism school is, or why it would be superior to getting an internship at a newspaper and doing journalism. Because it seems to me the essential charge of journalism is so clear, so basic. Find out what happened, report it truthfully. There's not a lot to it. I mean, there's a lot of technique one learns in doing it, and there is some, I think, soul-searching involved when you actually have to do it. But the job description is not that tough. I mean, to become a master electrician takes a number of years, and it should. Journalism, much simpler. It's just a matter of living up to it. And as I said, again and again, I don't think we do.
Thank you. Although many of us are just as likely to be shocked by poor journalism as by bad wiring.
But not killed.
Well, many people are. Let me answer the same question. Should the media be unbiased, and what would media look like if it were unbiased?
Good line. I'm going to use that line. Is my mic on? No. Yeah. Is my mic on? Well, you know, I do teach journalism, but I'm kind of a skunk in this garden party with regard to objectivity. I don't believe in it. I don't think when Tucker says that there's a certain category of things we can all agree on, and everything else ought to be contested, I'm not so sure I agree that we ought to agree on anything. You know, When we were attacked in 9/11, there wasn't really anybody on television who didn't say we need to go and blow up some places, who was allowed on television for the next few days. And there wasn't really anybody who wasn't considered crazy who didn't think we should go in and take out the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, I actually supported that myself. But I didn't. The rest of the world didn't. Most of the rest of the world thought that we were making a mistake by going into Afghanistan in the way we did, which is not to say that it would have been wrong to kill those people who attacked us, and it would be unavoidable to have a few innocent people get killed at the same time, and that's just life or death. But that there were more effective ways to deal with this problem than the one that our leadership chose. And that, say, the Europeans who've been dealing with this problem for decades have had a lot more experience, and we could have learned something from their example. But these things were unsayable in the United States at that time. They were part of the 99.9% that Tucker says we all agree on. But in fact, I think they were wrong. Now, there are an awful lot of issues, maybe not an awful lot, but they're very important, which in the mainstream media are considered unsayable. Okay? If you're against quote-unquote free trade, you're outside of the discourse of responsible American journalism. And yet, in the rest of the world, what we call free trade is seen in many places as corporate domination. And these treaties like the GATT treaty and the WTO and NAFTA are considered free investment treaties, but not free trade treaties. And really, if you're going to have a free trade treaty, you don't need 20,000 pages. You just have free trade.
You can finish up with your answer.
Yeah. The fact is that the American people share that latter position. I wrote a book on democracy and foreign policy. Most Americans support protectionism. But this view is viewed with contempt in the mainstream media, and so it gets no resonance in the system. So my argument would be let's just tell people what we think is true. Let's give them the evidence that we think is important, and let's let them make up their own minds. But let's not pretend to be something that's impossible, because by doing so, we delegitimate the other viewpoint. And quite frequently, history will show us that other viewpoint was the one that would have served us much better.
Great, thank you. I'm going to switch order here for the next couple of questions. That mention of the economic aspect leads me to the next question. Last year, our Center for Film, Television, and Media had a year-long series on media ownership, and we're still very interested in this issue. So a question would be, what is the role and consequence of the increasing ownership of media outlets by large corporations on media bias? That is the relationship between that economic model, the changing economic model, and what we're ambiguously referring to here as media bias? And you may start.
Well, there are two main problems with media concentration. You know, when Ben Bagdikian first published his book on it in 1970-something, I think 1970, first edition of a book called The Media Monopoly, he was worried that there were only 50 media companies that controlled the vast majority of information that people in Western countries receive. It's now down to between 5 and 6, depending on how you count. So that's clearly a problem, that there are only 5 and 6 groups of people who are creating the marketplace of ideas. That's a very significant problem, because that's a very small marketplace of ideas. But when you think about it, these corporations, they're not single monolithic corporations. They're enormous corporations with lots and lots of tentacles in different areas. And none of these corporations is capable of reporting honestly about itself. And neither would you be if you were in that position, because you work for a boss and your boss works for a boss, and everybody's got to worry about the health of the corporation. That whatever walls that used to exist between church and state in this regard have come down. And so everybody's responsible for the health of the corporation. And that means you don't, if you're a journalist at CNN, you don't go after a Warner Brothers movie and show that that half the budget was spent on cocaine. You don't do it.
That would be inaccurate.
Yeah. Because it's just not a good career move. No one has to tell you not to do it. You understand it's going to make everybody uncomfortable. I work for MSNBC.com. I think I probably criticize MSNBC cable more than anybody else who works for MSNBC.com.
But I don't do it as often as I should.
Great. Well, thank you.
Neither do I.
So we ask you the same question. What's
I
the
just think
relationship?
it's I mean, look, it's a complicated question. Here's one of the alarm bells that goes off. I've debated this many, many times, and it's almost always in an academic environment. Let me just say that the people I know who are most exercised about media conglomeration are people who've never worked in the media, which always tells you something. It's people who don't actually really know what they're talking about, which always sort of worries me. That said, yeah, there are big problems with it. There's no question about that. Eric is absolutely right that there is pressure, I think, and it's a subtle pressure, not to report on things that might affect the company, whichever company it is, adversely. But there is a much deeper problem, and that is it makes news gathering and news coverage a corporate function, right? So like when my father dropped out of high school at 17, joined the Marine Corps, and then got a job at the LA Times. You think someone who drops out of high school at 17 is getting a job at the LA Times right now? I don't think so. Unless he's like, disabled lesbian Samoan, whatever. Who's got, well, I'm serious. Who's got, 9 different aggrieved groups behind him doing it. No, you're not going to get a job. So, there. Why? Because being a journalist is now a profession, right? It's a white-collar profession. It's not a trade at all. Well, that's good and bad. Papers are probably, strictly speaking, more accurate than they were in the 1960s, maybe. But they're a whole lot less fun. There are a lot more dorky, uptight people there trying to climb the corporate ladder, so it makes it just a much less appealing job for people who want to become journalists to see the world and have adventure and tell the truth. And also, there's a common sense deficit. Always like Ivy League educated, uptight people working there who have theories and they can't see the truth for the theories. I'm sorry, the cliches are true. Those people are lacking common sense. And there are far too many of them in newsrooms, I think. I don't like them at all.
Well, the LA Times is taking care of that by keeping fewer and fewer of them. There's been some really good stories in New York Magazine on the decline of the LA Times. We're switching now to a different question about media, and then soon we're going to switch to audience questions. And again, I'll start with you, Mr. Carlson. What do you think the effects are of the rise of the internet, blogs, podcasts, now videocasts on media bias?
Boy, it's hard to address this without just coming out with the normal cliches about how they're keeping us honest. I mean, I have such mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I resent the hell out of the fact that some guy, who lives life in his undershorts eating Ben & Jerry's in his basement on the computer can have an effect on my life. I hate that. On the other hand, you got to admit, it's amazing. Some of these people, have an effect, and a lot of times it's an unwarranted effect, and it's unfair, and it's kind of a crowd bully mentality, but sometimes it's totally fair. The piece, my feelings on this are inchoate at this point, is the bottom line. But let me just say this. This is how you know things are changing. This week, this Million Little Pieces book by James Fry was completely discredited in the single most devastating piece from any media I've read in a long time. And I read everything. I mean, I read every magazine. I read a lot of journalism. This piece was on the smokinggun.com. It dissects this book in a completely responsible, completely almost impossible to challenge way, and it was published online by, in a way that will never see cold print. And it tells you something about how things really are changing. I don't know. I don't think it's bad. It's never bad to have more information, more sources of information out there, and it's one of the reasons that media conglomeration doesn't bother me as much as it might, because concurrent with the consolidation of media has been the rise of alternative media, given voice by the internet at very low cost. And so, yes, it's scary that GE owns everything, but then some random guy in his boxer shorts can provide an alternative, and it's great.
All right. Mr. Alterman, who I presume does not wear boxer shorts.
I don't know what Bill Gates wears, but I'd rather get paid by GE than by a guy in his boxer shorts. That's one big one big difference between blogs and the mainstream media is that good journalism is very expensive. And blogs are, I think, admittedly, I've done a blog for MSNBC. I think I was the second person to be hired by a corporation to be a blogger after Mickey Kaus was. Same corporation. They're parasitical on the work that journalism organizations pay for. And as that economic model of journalism collapses, it's a real problem that blogs can't solve. My feelings about blogs are not all that different than Tucker's in terms of, well, they're good and they're bad, and it depends on the situation, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. But I guess it's worthwhile to try to distinguish in what ways they're good and what ways they're bad. One way they're very good is they allow for democratic conversation outside of the media itself. They allow citizens to communicate with each other in a way that they couldn't do beforehand because they had to go through the media and the media wouldn't let them in certain ways. And that's good. Democratic conversation is good. I'd rather live in a Deweyite world in that sense than a Lippmannite world. But they're bad because a lot of the information, because the gatekeeper function of the media is a useful one, and that's collapsing as well. You know, I liked blogs when Atrios and Josh Marshall pointed out that, hey, the Republican leader, the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate, is making all kinds of racist statements and has his entire life, and maybe he shouldn't be the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate, and now he no longer is. And all the Washington journalists who were in the room when Trent Lott made his statements in support of Strom Thurmond's 1948 racist campaign didn't think anything was a problem with it, and it took these outsiders in their pajamas to say, hey, wait a minute, this is a problem. I didn't like blogs so much when, in the case of the documents having to do with Dan Rather and George Bush's quote-unquote military service, we lost the issue of whether or not George Bush did in fact do that military service, where it was never discussed. The only issue was discussed was where these documents came from. And by the way, most people don't know this, but the reports those documents that CBS presented that night have still yet to be discredited. The internal report that Mr. Thornburg and the other guy, the former head of AP, did not discredit those documents. They don't know if those documents are true or not. But these blogs were they were so well organized and so rabid in their ability to focus this issue on questions that have yet to be answered about the documents. And I'm not defending the journalism. I'm just saying that the lack of a gatekeeper function in that is something that we've lost, and sometimes that's going to be good and sometimes it's going to be bad. But it makes me a little bit nervous because there's an awful lot of crazy ideas out there circulating, and they can be very dangerous if somebody's not keeping an eye on them.
And in my gatekeeper role, I'll end that there. I have one last question, and this relates back to the importance of debate. And the obvious idea about debate is not only to be informed, but also to perhaps learn something from someone else. And so my question to each of you, and I'll start with Mr. Alterman, is what have you learned from this debate about the other person's perceptions, arguments, or positions?
I think I'm going to use that birthday thing now.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Tucker? No, look. Here's the thing. Tucker's not crazy. Tucker's not crazy. And Tucker, in the privacy of this well-heeled, intelligent audience, sounds like a perfectly reasonable person who you wouldn't mind having dinner with, and you could discuss all of these issues at considerable length. But when Tucker was on Crossfire, Tucker's job was to argue on behalf of an awful lot of things that just don't make a damn bit of sense. And you can see he's a much nicer, much smarter person than you ever would have guessed from having watching on those shows. And to me, this is a reflection of something to which he alluded earlier, which is that the conservative movement in this country has gone off the rails. And that it's true liberalism went off the rails in the late 1960s and early 70s. And we're in an interesting moment in American history now where we're living without a practicable ideology. This whole Abramoff scandal is an indication that conservatism now is just about getting rich. There's nothing else to it really anymore. And the problem with that is that they're still running things. You know, George Bush is going to be there for 3 more years, and the Republican Congress isn't going anywhere either because of the structure of our political system. So what I learned is that I'm very pleased to see someone who is a famous media conservative basically making sense in an audience like this. I like to see it a lot more often on television.
Thank you. I'm not sure I've learned so much as had previous observations confirmed. I've had the same experience over the years. I alluded to living on both coasts and always, probably by chance, living in very liberal neighborhoods. And I've had the same experience on average about once a week for the past 10 years. I'll be with my kids at a coffee shop in our neighborhood. I'll be getting on an airplane, standing in line for the movies at the urinal in the men's room. And someone will come up to me and say, you know what? I'm a liberal, but I like you. And I'll say, well, thanks. And he'll say, you don't really mean that stuff you say on TV, do you? And I'll look at him just dead serious and say, every word. And he'll say, I know, but just between, and he'll kind of look around, just between you and me. I mean, you know, really, the crackpot stuff, I mean, come on. And I'll say, actually, I really do mean every word. And I mean that when I say that. I have never said a word I don't mean. My opinions have evolved, become more conservative, actually, in almost every way. But it's taught me this, and this is the fundamental difference between liberals and conservatives. Conservatives distrust politics at its root. They think politics is really kind of an unappealing means to an end, and the end is being left alone, to live your own life and work your job and go to church or do whatever you want, hang out with your family, right? You do politics, you can do that. Liberals believe politics is almost an end. Politics is the way you make things better ultimately, almost the way you make human nature better. Politics is, for liberals, kind of the answer. They have real faith in politics. Because of that, they have a lot of trouble believing that someone they disagree with politically can be a decent person. So the only way they can fit those two competing ideas in their heads, wait, you believe evil things, therefore you must be evil, but hold on, I like you anyway, is you must be lying. The answer, I'm not lying. So Eric Alterman has just yet again proved that liberals believe that. And I can just say, for the record, every single crackpot thing I said on Crossfire, I deeply believed and still do.
Okay. Again, in the spirit of debate and democracy, we will have some opportunities for interaction and participation. We have 2 microphones here. Anybody would like to answer a question? I'm going to once again encourage you to be very short and clear and not make a statement, but ask a question. You can address it to either person or to both. And we can start because there's more people here, not because it's on my right and your left. You'll start.
Thank you. This question's for Mr. Carlson. The issue of ignorance came up, specifically with Iraq. And you mentioned that it wasn't ignorance that took us into Iraq, and you mentioned Daschle and Senator Clinton. Do you believe that ignorance plays a role in people's support of any issue at all these days, or yeah?
Absolutely. I mean, look, ignorance is a byproduct of bad judgment. So, I mean, I beg your pardon. There's no reason in the era of the internet to be ignorant about public affairs. I mean, there's actually no excuse at all. It's all free. All the information you need to base your judgments on, it's almost all there. I mean, I'm sure Eric will correctly point out examples where there is esoteric and there's hidden information, okay? But generally, it's all there. The reason this is and I'll make this very short, but this is kind of at the heart of this lobbyist scandal in Washington right now. The question is, do lobbyists have too much influence? Well, of course they do. Why do they have that influence? It's the money. Yeah, that's part of it. I lived in Washington 15 years, but one thing I learned, you know why they have so much influence, lobbyists? Because they know what the legislation is. Do you know who else knows what the legislation is? No one. Not even the people voting on it. There are many pieces of legislation that are not read by the people casting votes on that legislation. That's true. The only people you can be certain have read every single word are the lobbyists. The bottom line is, while the rest of us are living our lives and coming to things like this and going out and getting loaded at dinner and watching HBO, the lobbyists are sitting and reading what our laws are going to be. That's their fundamental advantage over us. And so I just have basically, zero sympathy for people who don't take the time to learn what their government's doing and then whine about it later. I'm sorry, I just don't. You can have the information, and if you don't avail yourself of it, tough luck, pal. Democracy is, it's there for you, and you just didn't take it. It's your fault.
Can I just very quickly, on this point in ignorance and the Iraq and the Hillary Clinton and Tom Daschle, 2 significant points. One is, if you look at what they were voting on, and if you talk to them today, they will tell you that they were voting to give the president the power to go to war in order to go to the UN and convince the European powers to support us. You can believe it or not, but that's what they voted on. Second thing is, they were lied to by the President of the United States. They were given false information. And most of them, John Kerry, John Edwards, have all said, even Joe Biden, who's still a hawk, has said, I would not have voted that way had I known the truth. And I regret trusting this president, and I'll never trust him again.
You believe that? I hold my leaders to a much higher standard than that, I have to say. If someone I voted for ever said that, mental note, I will never vote for you. I'll devote the rest of my life to seeing you defeated. That is such a pathetic dodge. Stand up, be a man, take responsibility for your mistake. That's right.
Audience members are standing and take responsibility. Your question.
Thank you. Eric pointed out that there is no environmental or labor section in the newspaper, and that's representative of another bias, which is that the media seems to be event-driven rather than issue-driven. Americans work the equivalent of 2 months a year more than Europeans do, and that's this elephant in the living room that never gets covered because it's an issue, it's not an event. I throw that out to both of you. How could it be that a huge issue like Americans working 2 months a year more than Europeans never gets covered?
I'm writing a book now on the state of American liberalism. And if you look at, I mean, Tucker's right. It's very hard to define what liberals believe anymore. And the sort of dodge I take is we would like to live in Europe. Not actually live in Europe, but live in a country that's a lot more like Europe, where everybody has 5 weeks vacation, where education is paid for, where health care is paid for, where we have a strong union movement, where, people's pensions aren't taken away. If you grow up in Finland, there's no private schools in Finland. Everybody has exactly the same educational opportunities in Finland from the time before you're born through the time you finish medical school. The government pays all of your educational expenses as well as your living expenses while you're studying to be whatever it is you want to be. We're wealthy enough to do that in this country, and we choose not to, okay? Now, this issue of work is the same thing. We have 2 weeks vacation if you're lucky, if you still got a vacation, which is a lot of people are losing, whereas in Europe you have about 6 weeks. I don't know if I think you're slightly exaggerating. I think that's a better system, okay? I think their system is better than ours. But liberals have been very ineffective at making these arguments. Part of it is because there's a conservative domination of the media. Part of it is because liberals have been politically ineffective. And the third reason is you're right. The only kinds of issues that the American media can deal with are issues of personal conflict. So even if there is an issue of enormous import for people's lives, like, say, the Medicare bill, it still comes down to rock'em sock'em robots. And this guy says this, what do you say that? You saw it with Alito. I mean, where was the actual philosophical discussion about these positions that are going to determine the state of the country, maybe more than any election for a long time? It was completely missing. That's the nature of our political system. I agree with you. It's a long haul. Tucker, and I like to actually hear Tucker speak this. Tucker,
okay, let's let him.
But could I just?
You have 2 minutes.
I just want to. He didn't let me finish the sentence, though.
Okay, finish the sentence.
Tucker speaks rather condescendingly of theory, of issues, of questions, saying, let's just report the news. But aren't these larger issues and questions, even theoretical questions, just as important for people to...
Absolutely. And let me just say quickly, though, to go back to Finland. If Finland is this great utopia, no one's told the Finns. This is a country with the second highest suicide rate in the world after Cuba. If that's the product of having no private schools and living in a perfect society.
Tucker, I want you to support that on altercation next week. I don't think that's true.
It is true.
I don't think
actually. I also think the Europeans are lazy, just for the record. It's true. I love Europe. I'm the only right-wing French defender in America, but they are lazy, let's be honest. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right that the press has a bias, of course, toward the working press. The day-to-day, the daily press has a strong and overwhelming bias to, what they call spot news, events that are happening rather than trends. I think that's the way it should be. Trust me, you don't want the average newspaper reporter trying to figure out what anything means. Trust me. That's not his job. That's the job of magazine writers. And they do a great job. Read the Atlantic Monthly, for which Eric writes sometimes. In fact, have one of the great pieces, I have to say, they have run in a very long time. piece on environmentalism in Hollywood. It's a magazine, and there are other magazines like it, the New Yorker to some limited extent, and there are others that pay people to think about what things mean and what America's and the world is going to look like 25 years from now. There's a lot of really great journalism going on. It's just not daily journalism. And those are just completely two different things.
We have a question over here.
You, Mr. Carlson, have presented yourself quite differently today than you would on Crossfire. As the last question Mr. Alterman said in response to is that you seem very sane and reasonable. He's right. My question, the first part is, why can't you be like this on TV? But not just you, all pundits. Why can't we have reasonable, rational discourse like this in a structured environment? Why does the only form of debate we see on corporate television, or any television for that matter, have to be a shouting match? And since you believe everything you say, since you stand so firmly behind everything you say, did you ever eat your shoe?
Well, let me start the first part. The first part first. I bet you $20 you've never seen my show that I have on MSNBC. And if you have, I would be amazed that you could say what you just said.
No, I haven't.
Okay. I think you're mistaking me for some angry Irish Catholic guy in Fox.
No, just from Crossfire.
Okay. I was never that way. I'm the angry Episcopalian guy on MSNBC. And I was never like that. I'm sorry, I'm not being defensive. I have done things I'm ashamed of. I have done wrong things. I'm the first to admit that I'm morally superior to no one. I'm not self-righteous. That's my one virtue. But I can tell you, I have never been a screamer. I've gotten pissed, okay? But I was across from screaming. I mean, this is not just a defense. I'm telling you the God's honest truth. Look at the tape. I was across from, right, okay? That was not me. You've been reading the reviews rather than watching the reality. Read the transcript any day you want. Second, did I eat the shoe? No. Mrs. Clinton was magnanimous enough to come on the show and let me out of that obligation. Now, let me just say quickly, I promised to eat my shoe, whatever, if she sold 1 million copies of her book, and I was misled by my former book editor, who's now the publisher of a very large imprint, who said, she'll never sell 1 million copies. I voted for it. I love that one, but she'll never sell it. And so I heard this at lunch and stupidly repeated it on the air. So what do I know about publishing? Not much.
So if you didn't eat your shoe, did you fire your agent?
I don't have an agent.
Right.
I need one.
That's the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question over here.
Mr. Alterman, you talked about accountability in the government. What do you both think about accountability in the media? For instance, they are kind of being beasts right now, and like the miners, they reported that 12 were alive and 12 obviously weren't, and then they go and say, well, how'd the corporation mess up? Or they're very, very, very willing to expose things in the government before they really know if they're true or not, and just go on with the stories without having the actual facts.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's the nature of the beast, that we've always had that media. We've always had those problems as long as we've had a media, and as long as it's profitable, we will always have it. I do think there's a problem with the argument that many people in the media say, well, you people should stop watching it and then we won't give it to you anymore, that it's a demand-related issue. I'm not sure that's the case. I'm not sure the Americans are demanding to know every little detail about Natalie Holloway. But the numbers, Tucker might know more about this than I do, the numbers required to have a successful cable station are so relatively small compared to the population. Just about 300 million people in America, and you can be very successful if you have 500,000 or 1 million every night. So as long as there's that kind of audience, you're going to get this kind of reporting, and there's nothing done about it except to morally shun these people if you come across them. But this is a capitalist country, and this sells.
That's totally true. I was actually on live when that miner story broke. And so I was the one, who went to that, and I was talking, and I got in my ear, oh my gosh, I heard screaming in the control room, hold on, and we're hearing that they're alive, and the camera's on me, and I didn't, so I'm hearing all this, and I just said, let's go right to the scene, and we turned out to be wrong. I felt bad about it. The question is, what do you do differently? The authorities on the scene are saying they're alive. The families have been notified they're alive. We were able to verify the families have been notified they were alive. And they had been. And so you report what you know in the end, and what we knew was wrong. And again, I felt bad about it, and I object to any efforts to whitewash our role in disseminating lies, which is what we did. It was unwitting, but it was still wrong. And I think the press always, covers its own tracks, and nobody wants to admit his fault. But let me just say very quickly, the problem is actually the reverse. It's not the press isn't accountable enough. It's too accountable. We're way too influenced by what different pressure groups think. From what GE thinks, our corporate, the company we both work for, all the way down to what people who organize letter writing campaigns think. I think we should be reporting what we believe is true. That's what we're hired to do. But I can think of dozens of examples over the last 15 years in my life where, we've gotten 25 angry letters about something and you get called in for a talking to. Well, you're really offending people. And I think our response as journalists should be, give them the middle finger. I mean, that's how I feel. But we don't, because we're afraid to lose readers or viewers. It's a shame.
I'm the timekeeper, and rather than giving the middle finger, let's give a great round of applause for our two presenters.